one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Let's do the roll call.
Commissioner Denny.
Here.
Commissioner Hill.
Here.
Commissioner Smith.
Here.
Commissioner Stevenson.
Here.
Chair Workman.
Here.
Excused this evening is Chair McLean and Commissioner Nutrock.
Can I have the approval of the minutes of the last meeting? Have anyone any changes?
I'll motion that they be accepted.
Second.
I hear it. Motion to approve the minutes and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those against? Passes. Do we have anyone here that wants to make a public comment? Okay. We don't have a public hearing tonight. So we got some unfinished business, the critical areas ordinance.
I'll start off by introducing. As you may recall, we have periodically touched upon this topic in the last several months. That we are operating under the Growth Management Act, and every jurisdiction operating under the Growth Management Act has to have a critical areas ordinance that meets best available science. And that best available science changes from time to time as science improves, or when new studies come out, or also the legislation itself changes, and agencies may adopt different protocols and different recommendations. And so all of us who work under the Act and have critical areas ordinances from time to time have to update them. The center is in that position to update its ordinance. We are behind schedule, as I've mentioned in the past, and so it's important for us to try to move through this process expeditiously, unlike the Shorelines Master Program, which we don't need to talk about, and complete this update. So I started working with you on this a number of months ago. We did submit a draft update to the Department of Commerce, received comments back from the Department of Ecology, and I asked the city if they would consider bringing some experts on to help get this through the rest of the adoption process. And so I've had the pleasure of working with both of these gentlemen for a number of years. I trust their judgment and on most things. And I think they'll do a good job of getting this update at least through the process, but hopefully in a way that you all are comfortable with and understand completely. So I know that they're very willing to take questions, explain things as much as you need, but we are out of compliance essentially, and so we do need to move through it. Some of the things that they'll tell you about are simple housekeeping matters that you just need to adopt, and others are more policy oriented, and that's where your expertise and your sense of how the community sentiments are is really important to help guide the ordinance. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ethan Spoo with WSP, and he's going to take over from here. I'll be sitting in the back.
Got to get the mic adjusted here. Not made for tall people every Friday, Jeff.
You know what? My trick is to put it up on that ledge.
Oh, gotcha. That's better.
There you go.
All right, so my name is Ethan Spoo. Good evening, and I work for a company called WSP out of Vancouver. And you may have heard the name in the past, Berger ABAM. And on some of the materials that we produce the best available science report that Eric may have talked to you about in the past. And so WSP purchased Berger ABAM earlier this year, and that merger was complete in May. So yes, there's a different company talking to you right now than talking to you earlier in the year, but it's actually the same two people that have been involved in this project for WSP and Berger ABAM going back to last year. So WSP does have a bit of experience working with critical areas ordinances. We're currently drafting a critical areas ordinance for the cities of White Salmon, and then Skamania County, Goldendale, out in Klickitat County, and then helping you all with your critical areas ordinance update. So we bring that perspective to the table, but we also bring the perspective of some of our clients. A lot of our clients are private sector clients, and we prepare critical area reports such as wetland delineations and habitat studies for those clients. We do the same thing for some of our public sector clients who have infrastructure projects that go through critical areas or have to go through critical areas for one reason or another. And we also, for our public sector clients, serve in an on-call planning review capacity. So for some of the cities that we work for, we prepare staff reports reviewing critical areas reports that have been prepared by other consultants. So we like to think at least that we tackle this from multiple angles, and we hope that we're able to give you some good guidance that help get you through that discussion. So we're also responsible, unfortunately, for the bulk and the heft of the Planning Commission packet so this month, and so apologize for that. But I think that, as you know, what we're here to talk to you about tonight is not just the critical areas ordinance, but more specifically the ecology comments that were provided back in March. So we're going to walk you through some of the most important comments that ecology provided to you. We can't get through all of those comments, and we're not going to try to. And so if you have questions about topics or comments that I'm not bringing up, then by all means raise your hand, and we can try and address those comments as well. So I think from staff's perspective, and we're considering ourselves staff, consulting staff here as well as city staff, we're aiming, and we think it's an achievable goal to have a new critical areas ordinance, or I should say a revised critical areas ordinance adopted by the end of this year. And so we had planned to spend a couple of months with you talking to you about the critical areas ordinance and getting you comfortable with the changes in it, and then would hopefully move on to city council after that point. So we think that that's an entirely achievable thing. For tonight, mainly just discussion, but depending on how that discussion goes, we could come back to you next month with a revised ordinance consistent with the discussion here tonight, and then we could discuss those changes more specifically. Tonight, we're just talking about it at a concept level. We haven't made the changes that we're going to be talking to you about yet, and that's what would happen in the coming months. So I think Eric mentioned to you best available science, and I also mentioned that we prepared a best available science report for this project earlier in the year. And so that's a term that you're going to hear that's thrown around quite a bit with regard to critical areas ordinances. And the reason is because the state in WAC 365 190, 195 I think it is, 900, has a requirement that critical areas ordinances protect the functions and values of those critical areas in accordance with best available science. And so best available science, I mean, kind of in a nutshell, are peer-reviewed scientific studies on different topics that pertain to critical areas, such as, a really common one are riparian buffers. And so the state has put out guidance of its own that summarizes that science, and then there's other science out there that's not necessarily incorporated into the state guidance. There's a huge body of science out there, but the state as I said, is probably the most convenient source of summarizing that science. So the Department of Ecology, for instance, has wetlands ratings and delineation wetlands ratings manuals, and they summarize the science behind wetland protection in that manual. And WDFW has some guidance documents that talk about riparian buffers, so those are buffers along streams, and what the science is behind that. So those are just a couple of examples. So I mention that just because that's the lens that the state is looking at La Center's critical areas ordinance in. Now, La Center has the authority and the obligation to adopt a critical areas ordinance in compliance with best available science, but the state doesn't have approval authority of that ordinance, of what you ultimately adopt. They may comment on it as ecology has, excuse me, but they don't have approval authority. So that's different than your shoreline master program that you worked on a couple of years ago, where ecology had the approval authority, and so that was locally adopted, and then it got shipped off to the Department of Ecology, and they had the approval authority. And so if something wasn't meeting their guidance, then they could say, revise this, or we're not going to approve your shoreline master program. They don't have that authority here, and so that specifically lies with the La Center City Council. Go ahead.
Just not to gloss over that, that is a distinction I wasn't aware of. Is this something that's new, or has it always been this way? Or and what? Not drag it out, but why one and not the other? Why they would be approving one and not the other? Is there?
It basically just gets back to the statutes that regulate those two different things, and there's two different statutes. So the Shoreline Management Act is what regulates the updates of shoreline and master programs, and that says the Department of Ecology has the ultimate approval authority, whereas the Growth Management Act is what you have to meet for critical areas ordinance.
So that falls under that jurisdiction.
Right.
Gotcha.
And then the Shoreline Master Act, Shoreline Management Act was passed, I think, in 1971, predating the Growth Management Act regulations by almost 25 years.
Gotcha.
And so, two separate statutes, two separate time periods, and then there was a significant court case dealing with the Shoreline Master Program.
Yeah, appreciate that.
They
Thank
came
you.
up with a compromise.
Thank you.
They came up with a compromise. It's not a perfect compromise, but it's a compromise. And so, at any rate, that's kind of the regulatory landscape that we're working in here. And so that's also why you get so many different varieties and flavors of critical areas ordinances across the state, because everybody has their interpretation of the best available science, and they've collected their best available science, which isn't to say that you can cherry pick that science, but they may have used slightly different science along the way towards adoption of their critical areas ordinance, and they have unique local conditions that they've used to tailor their critical areas ordinance. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and talk about some of the specific changes that were, or address some of the specific comments that Ecology put forth, and some of the changes that we would recommend that the city undertake to address those comments. I'll go ahead and work through. This is the memo that I put together that kind of summarizes a lot of these issues. We're not going to go through even all the issues in the memo, which is a subset of the issues that are in of the comments that are in the code. So we're going to be dealing with a subset of a subset here tonight, simply because there's quite a few comments on this, which is typical of ecology and our experience.
Can you all see that finally? Jeff, you
It might be better to-
figure? It's difficult on the far end of the glass thing.
Thank you.
Can we cut off half the lights?
Yeah.
Maybe half of the debris,
In front.
or at least partial of them.
We got it here too.
When we do that.
That's too much. Can you see okay there, though?
I can see,
How about that?
that's fine.
That works.
Before I go any further, though, I guess I neglected to mention my cohort in crime,
Yes.
Dusty Day, and he is a natural resource scientist, so he's one of the people that, for WSP's private clients, is preparing critical areas reports and wetlands delineations, and so he has that hands-on experience in addition to working on revising critical areas ordinances for the clients that we have in common. So this sort of first suite of comments that I'd like to talk about deal with single-family residences, and those are, as you know, the most predominant land use type in the center. So we figured that that was an important issue to address. And so if you look at what would be page 25 of the Planning Commission packet, which is within the critical areas code, Ecology recommended, there's a table there, and it talks about the review process for different land uses within critical areas and their buffers. And so Ecology recommended that single-family uses on existing lots be changed from an exempt development or an exempt activity to one that requires a critical areas report. So that's their first comment. And then further down, and I'll go through these in the code so you can see what I'm talking about. Go ahead.
Do you want us to ask questions along the way? How do you want to do
Feel
this?
free to ask questions along the way, and so if something's burning you up, go ahead and.
Well, like on that first one right there, my first thing that hit me on that was we're now adding more government oversight. And I'm wondering, is that also to somehow them doing that, does that somehow get ecology in the act to some level? Or is that just their comments? Or does it really have a greater context and the fact that it's going to involve perhaps them in some kind of review process?
Well, so it depends on the type of critical area you're talking about. If you're talking about wetlands, then if you were to propose a single-family house in a wetland buffer or perhaps even filling a wetland, then at that point Ecology would get involved in reviewing the delineation as well as issuing a 401 water quality certification. But they would be anyways, regardless of what they're recommending.
But they don't today, or they do today also?
They do today.
Also today, okay, thank you.
So economically, it doesn't have any impact, just changing it that way?
Economically meaning?
To the person that
impact on-
owns the lot that's going to be developed, before this change would be made, compared to after the change is made, is there any economic impact?
So,
Are they
so
going to write a
would-
check to somebody?
They're going to have to.
So they would have to, rather than being an exempt use, which wouldn't require them to prepare a critical areas report, so a wetland delineation, they would then have to prepare a wetland delineation and perhaps a mitigation plan for the impacts to the wetland buffer or the wetland itself.
Can you give us a comparison of what's been transpiring with the new school property that's under Ecology's lawsuit?
I don't have the background on that project, so
It's been delayed a year so far.
I feel like maybe there's a contaminated soils issue in dealing with wetlands, but
And maybe Eric, do you
There's
have
two
any?
issues. There's the contaminated soils issue from dumping agricultural products over the years, but then also during the review process, there was a disagreement between the biologist who was hired to do the delineation work and the agencies as to whether there were and to what extent wetlands were present on the site. So those two things are part of the project.
Dueling best available science?
So, sorry. So that was their first comment, was that it should be changed from an exempt use to critical areas report required. And then their second comment dealing with, let's see here if I can, maybe the pointer out, it'd be easier to see. Their second comment dealing with single-family residences is that they should have some additional review standards placed on them, because as you look at it now in this particular section of the code that we're going to take a look at, it basically says that single-family residences on existing lots of record are allowed uses. And it doesn't tell you what you have to do if you're, say, impacting a buffer or a critical area of some kind. So their recommendation is to include additional standards, no alternate location, so you have to demonstrate that you can't place it outside of the critical area and buffer. And the location minimizes disruption, impacts must be fully mitigated and monitored for 10 years. And they encourage the use of low-impact development stormwater techniques in the middle of the site development plan. So that's what they're recommending.
Is this the kind of language that they want to see, they're recommending that is in the code,
Yes.
basically?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which would not look like what we have in there today.
It would add additional standards to the review of single-family development
Right, okay.
in critical areas.
Thank you.
Can I just make a point also? Just a point of clarification here. The table that Ethan is talking about in the critical areas ordinance sets up sort of a hierarchy of review levels.
Okay.
The lowest level is you're exempt. You don't have to do anything. The next level is what's called review required, which the way that the city implements that actually right now is that we will say to a single-family property owner, well, it appears that there is a wetland on the site based on what Clark County GIS is telling us or some other agency information. So we want you to go out and hire the appropriate person and characterize what's out there. Tell us what's out there, because we don't want to rely on what GIS says. And then we'll decide what happens after that. Then there's the critical area report, which is the next sort of level of review, which says that go out, characterize the site, pay the biologist to do the work, come up with a mitigation plan, and that's a higher level of analysis and review. So I just want to make sure that they understand that there are these
No, that's
three
good
different
context.
levels. Yeah.
What would determine whether it was an RR or a CAR?
Staff, basically.
Using what criteria?
And
Well,
and the table.
And the table, exactly. So, for example, someone comes in, GI, and a developer is doing a project. Okay? They're already putting together a team of people. The staff says, well, it appears that there's some wetlands on site here, and we need you to go out and analyze those and probably prepare a critical areas report. And the developer usually goes, yeah, we've already taken a look at it. We've already sent somebody out there to do that. We understand that. As opposed to a single-family residence where the property owner goes, well, I don't have any developer underneath me. I'm going to go build my house. And so that's when they have not already prepared the ground and done the background work. That's when we as the staff just say, well, it appears there's a wetland there, so go ask someone to go tell you what's actually there so we know what to do. But we are not asking you to do a full mitigation plan, monitoring reports, or anything like that.
So if they did the review, just that basic review, and they determined there were wetlands, would you then say, okay, prepare the report, or would that?
If they say, yes, there are wetlands, and we say, avoid the wetlands,
Yeah.
okay? And they say, okay, great, we'll avoid the wetlands, then we're done.
Okay.
But if they say, no, I need to get a driveway in here, my septic field's gonna go over here, and I'm gonna have a bunch of impact on the wetlands, then we're gonna say, you're going to have to go get a critical areas report.
Okay.
That's the second step,
That's the second level of review, I guess you could say.
which is already in place today.
Correct.
Okay.
I'm going to go back to my earlier question about cost and the like. So going from the point where our existing program is there and people buy property based on what they're gonna do, based on whatever existing programs exist. Program gets amended, does that add additional cost then to the owner of the property, the developer of the property, to develop it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would, because they would have to prepare a critical areas report.
How much do those
Under,
cost?
Wetland delineation and mitigation plan, but,
How much do those cost?
I mean, it varies depending on the amount of wetland that's on your property and how much of it you're gonna be impacting, and therefore how much mitigation, which is basically planting or creation of new wetlands somewhere else. How much that report would cost, but.
It's a range, you know, and it depends on the client, but the consultant that they hire, but it could be from 2,000 to 10,000 depending on project, but would it also increase the city cost as well, or is it just a flat?
No, if there's no critical area land use application,
If there is, then so if you step
Then there's an
that tier,
application
then
fee.
there's an actual additional.
if we're just asking you to go out and go get somebody to tell us what's out there, there's no application fee for that. But if you apply for a critical areas report permit, then you have to pay some city fee in addition to whatever the consultant's being paid.
Eric, how many vacant properties are there out there that would be subject to this, do you think? In the city?
It's any property that hasn't yet developed or that plans to develop
Yeah,
from
I
the
mean,
point
If
this
it's
ordinance
any
is adopted
property that
out,
hasn't
right?
developed, if it's a legal lot, then right now in the city's plan, it's a legal lot of record. There are probably 3 dozen or more. Well, if I go to the other side of the river, there's 3 dozen probably on the other side of the river that this would qualify.
Sure.
On this side of the river, probably another dozen or two, a couple of dozen. Yeah, so maybe 48, 50 properties altogether.
But I think that's important because, you know, there's a lot of times you have changes and, you know, they impact a lot of properties.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just a matter of how much argument you want to have about a particular thing that ecology wants when there's not that many properties
See, the only time
impacted.
this really comes into effect is if you, the property owner, Mr. Denny, want to put your house on that piece of property. If you're going to hire a developer, you're going to go through the whole critical areas review.
Right.
But if you just want to put your one house, so that's really the answer to your question, Mr. Whitman. How many properties will be affected? If there may be 50 properties in town that are fully undeveloped where you could put a single-family home, the other part of the question is, how likely is that to happen?
So it's a subset of 50.
Yeah. I'm dealing with one right now, that's why I keep bringing it up.
Yeah.
And it's a property that no developer wants.
Well, you're moving along right along, aren't you?
Sorry. If I just needed to give you that context about the different layers.
Either, thank you.
So would it be,
Your meeting.
for clarification for the single-family residents, would it be up to us and the city council ultimately to decide whether that's going to be an RR or a CAR, and to make that decision?
Yeah, you would be making a recommendation to the city council, and then they would be.
Of either exempt, review required, or study
Right.
required?
Yeah, and I think we're going to provide some guidance to you on that, but I think from our perspective, the question is whether there's an impact or not. And if there's an impact, there's probably a critical areas report that needs to be done. So you could say that something is exempt and allow that use on the site, a single-family home, for instance. And if it didn't undergo any sort of review and it impacted the critical area, then you have basically a no-net loss, and you haven't met your state requirements to protect critical areas, functions, and values. So that's kind of the theoretical thinking that we're doing when we're looking at this critical areas ordinance, because it's our obligation and our job to help you stay in compliance with those requirements. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't, as I said before, some different flavors of this. For instance, some jurisdictions, rather than just kind of jumping to a critical areas report, you can go get a letter from a wetland consultant, and the consultant may say the mapping is correct or the mapping is incorrect. In the case the mapping is incorrect, maybe there's no wetland on the site, even though GIS says that there is. So a letter like that wouldn't cost very much money, like maybe $500 or $1,000, versus a full critical areas report, $2,000 to $10,000 maybe. So that's something that you could consider doing as well, in lieu of requiring a full critical areas report.
But to leave it exempt sets the city up for risk, because in the example you gave, when you said wouldn't be meeting the requirements for, was that the city wouldn't be meeting their requirements by allowing that, or the land property owner wouldn't be meeting the requirements?
If the city didn't regulate a use that it should be regulating that was going to impact a critical area, then that might leave it open to question or challenge.
For the city,
Right.
right.
But currently we are in fact doing that, requiring that
Right.
process.
Well, it's currently exempt for single family, is that not correct?
Well,
Yeah, and so that was,
it's certainly.
So we're currently not.
Well,
It's
Eric's,
currently exempt under the code, but in order to avoid problems with the agencies, I ask the people to go out
Oh, I see,
what's going on.
I see. Interim process.
yeah,
Because I don't want them to have to come back
Yeah.
and deal with the letter.
sounds like it.
I see.
From other people that we all know.
Okay, but since this involves a pretty small subset of potential things that can happen, and the net impact would be, I think, a situation now, if you have a developer, the developer's blocked from doing ecologically stupid things because they have to get this report. And it's a pretty good argument, why allow a private individual to go out and do stupid things? Right, by being exempt and not having to do it. So it looks like, to me, it looks like it makes sense from a scientific standpoint, but it doesn't seem to have a tremendous amount of economic impact because it doesn't involve that many properties. Is that a fair
That's what it
summary?
sounds like.
I would guess, Eric, and I don't know if you can comment on this, but I would guess of those, say, 50 vacant lots, there's probably not a lot that even have mapped wetlands on them if they've already been platted. I mean, that's just kind of a
Well,
wild
if they
guess,
were-
but
They may not be platted, they just might be pre-existing legal lots that date back to 75 years.
right.
Some of them, on the other side of the river, there's the 5-acre lots that are over there, those were platted, and so those actually were probably analyzed back in the 80s and 90s. But, yeah, it's a small impact, I think. overall.
This is a wetland haven here.
It's not battleground.
So from the standpoint of explaining things to the council when we get to that point, would that be something they'd be interested in, not knowing what the impact is
Yes.
pretty
Yeah,
small?
I think that's a very good point. County's making notable analysis. That's on the acre.
Okay, so those are sort of the first two comments on,
Sorry.
it's okay, on single-family residences. And then we go to the third comment, which is really just more of an inconsistency than anything. And so, under a different section of the code, single-family homes, an expansion of a home or accessory structure is regulated as a reasonable use exception, which usually a reasonable use exception is a type of process that you go through. It's similar to a variance process where you're making somebody jump through extra hoops to demonstrate that there's no other possibility for development of their property other than what they're proposing. And so it's kind of meant for a really small set of cases where critical areas might be impacting or encumbering most of a property or even an entire property, and the city doesn't want to, if the city were to regulate that property as the critical areas ordinance says it should, then that person wouldn't have any rights to develop their property. So the city doesn't want to get in that situation, so it creates reasonable use exceptions. And so the inconsistency is just that single-family residences are listed as a reasonable use exception as well as an allowed use under some of the code sections we already talked about. So I think our recommendation on that one would be to remove it from the reasonable use exception category, just regulate it as an allowed use with some specific standards that will ensure that you're protecting the critical areas, so you're not sort of doubling up and leading to confusion for applicants and staff in reading those code sections. So,
How many of those type of developments do you think are potential here in the center?
reasonable use exceptions, I'd have to take a wild guess at that, but it would have to be properties that are so encumbered by critical areas that there's nowhere else on that property, basically, to develop outside of the critical areas. So
Going Pacific Highway towards the west, okay, and you go down a little hill and there's a creek down there, okay? 3 small properties right there in that creek area.
McCormick Creek?
No, McCormick's in the center.
Oh,
This is Jenny's too far west. I'm drawing a blank on the name of the creek. But anyways, there are 3 very small properties that were broken up several years back, and they're almost, all 3 of them are almost 100% covered there. But we're finding a way to help out this.
Are they owned separately?
2 are owned by one group and one by another, if I remember. So there aren't many. But there are.
Under the reasonable use exceptions, the first bullet, it says 25%. What does that refer to? 25% of what?
25% encroachment into the buffer is what that's referring to. And so that's a feature of the existing code, and we're not proposing to change that, and so it's basically limiting encroachment into the buffer.
Okay, so they've got a certain amount of buffer on their property, and they can develop 25% of that without, or be exempt from that?
It might help if we turn to page 32 of your planning commission packet. I can bring it up here too.
Hard to hit the sweet spot.
So this is the reasonable economic use exception section that I was referring to, and this section basically says the following uses can be considered reasonable economic
32,
uses
this 32 is different.
of the property. So here's page 32. The top
That's towards the
page
end of the
32.
32. If you want to, yeah,
On here?
Did you find it?
there it is.
Uh,
You read it.
Yeah, I'm in the same place,
So
okay.
it says the placement of a new single-family residence of normal accessory structures on buildable legal lot of record created prior to 1994. The city shall employ reasonable discretion in applying the standards of this chapter to limit the proposed location and size of the structures and removal of native vegetation. So let's see here. So this is the 25% deals with the expansion of a single-family home or accessory structure. So
Oh,
that's
okay.
expanding into the buffer, and they're saying.
Expansion of the existing
Structure.
Oh, okay, it refers to the size of the
Ah.
existing building.
Right,
Okay.
not a new structure. So that's what that's dealing with. And so they're saying you can have this reasonable use exception, but you can't go any further for your expansion, but you can't go any further than 25% into the existing buffer. So that's dealing.
If in fact there's a buffer. That's what got you.
Actually, I'm sorry, it's 25% of the existing building footprint. That's what it's saying.
Of what?
Of
The building
existing
footprint.
building footprint.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's no longer a three-bedroom home, it's a four-bedroom home potentially, maybe, or whatever. You just made it a little bit larger.
Right. All right, so I'm going to go backwards just a little bit here. So keep that in mind, this reasonable use exception for the discussion moving forward, because essentially it's duplicated, as I said, in that allowed uses section. So that's why we're proposing to eliminate that duplication and just have it be an allowed use,
Well,
subject to some new standards that we've talked about.
Basically, just cleaning up the language.
Right.
Well, Ethan, one of the things that we've been trying to do here in the last several years, looking at the codes, is to try to keep it simple, straightforward, simple, understandable. And if we could take a lot of stuff out of fluff and stuff out of it that doesn't need to be there, that sounds like a piece that can come out and not harm anybody and makes it more workable document, I want to say.
Well, what would be the big differences or the impacts if it was one versus the other?
I mean, if it's a reasonable use exception is a higher bar, so you basically have to prove that you have no other option but to develop in the critical area. And it requires a type 3 process, which is a hearings examiner review, versus a type 2 process, which is a staff administrative review. So that's one of the reasons why we're recommending that it must be an allowed use rather than a reasonable use exception.
And then with the new restrictions that would be involved with the allowed use, in the end, would it be more appealing to the builder or the developer than having it as the, what it is now?
The reasonable use.
The reasonable,
exception.
yeah.
It's in both categories now. So it's mainly an issue of clearing up the confusion. If we were to leave it in the reasonable use exception category, it's a higher bar for them to meet to show that they indeed have such an encroachment of critical areas on their property, encumbrance of critical areas on their property, that they have to apply for that reasonable use exception process. So,
So I guess we don't really know what would look better until we understand what the new
right,
impacts on the allowed use would be.
right.
Okay.
Let me give you
So-
just a bit of context if I could. I've been dealing with critical area ordinances for over 25 years in multiple different jurisdictions, and not once have I ever had anybody raise a reasonable use exception. Ever. It just doesn't happen. And I just asked
It's
Dusty
rare.
for years for
Yeah.
never.
It's basically a legal requirement by the Washington State Attorney General to say you have to have this section in your code to ensure that you're not taking somebody's property rights in the case that their property is completely encumbered. I mean, that's kind of what
It is the required taking safeguard in the state law. Yep. But what they're suggesting is that we don't need to, we have to have a reasonable use exemption by state law, but we don't have to add the single-family residence into that because we can make it allowed elsewhere. Therefore, no one will ever raise a single-family home reasonable use exception if you allow it somewhere else.
Right,
Does that
so
muddy that up, Jeff?
Yeah, no, thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks.
getting back to what Ecology's comments were on this in terms of the allowed use, and I'm probably going way over the amount of time I should take on this. They're essentially saying add additional standards to the review of single-family uses, and then we're going a step further and saying, why is it even in the reasonable use exception? Let's just consolidate it and put in allowed uses. Put those standards along with the allowed use to ensure that the critical area is protected. We can go over those again if you want, but it's the stuff that's toward the bottom of
Okay.
page 5 of your agenda packet that we mentioned earlier. So there's no alternate location. Location minimizes disruption. So basically you're saying, okay, if you have to impact it, where's the location on that site that's going to be least impactful? impacts must be fully mitigated and monitored for 10 years, so if you're removing vegetation in a wetland buffer, then you're going to be required to plant vegetation somewhere else on the site. That's sort of the most typical type of mitigation that we deal with. You have to monitor that mitigation for 10 years, so if you plant, then somebody has to come out every couple of years, take a look at those plantings, make sure they're doing well, because if they're not doing well, then it's failed mitigation and you really haven't mitigated. Encouraging use of low-impact development, again, encouraging low-impact development, stormwater techniques are basically infiltrating stormwater into the ground instead of putting them through pipes and ponds, which is the more typical method. And then submittal of a site development plan, which would be required anyways. So those are the additional requirements that would go along with it as an allowed use. Okay, so those are the points I wanted to cover on single-family uses. Unless there's more questions at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dusty, and he's going to talk to you about some features of the wetland code and the habitat code.
All right, so please feel free to jump in again anytime you have questions. It can be confusing to say the least. So the first one that we wanted to kind of bring up, and I don't know if this was actually a comment from ecology, but it talks about oak woodlands, and oak woodlands are considered priority habitat by Department of Fish and Wildlife, and so because they're considered a priority habitat, it's also considered, it could be considered critical areas. They typically are through jurisdictions throughout the state. And optionally, you can nominate them to be, maybe even elevate the status to like a habitat of local importance. And some jurisdictions do that if they feel that oaks are worth adding measures for protection. So that was kind of a question we have to the commission. Is that something that you want to maybe provide additional protections for in going with the local habitat of local importance, or just keeping it consistent with what WFW recommends in terms of protecting? And so if you're looking at a property owner, a single-family residence, for example, and there's some oaks on site and they need to impact those oaks to get a house on, WFW would recommend that you mitigate for the loss of those trees and plant some more oaks somewhere else on your property and monitor it like Ethan was saying. And that's the standard recommendation, but there could be additional recommendations, making all trees larger than a certain diameter to be preserved on all properties. So that's more of a question to the commission really at this point, and I wanted to know if there's a direction that you'd like to go on that.
I got a general question. Do we actually have some way of knowing within our community what the oak population is?
We're talking about Oregon white oak.
Correct, Oregon white oaks. There are some mappings within the city by Department of Fish and Wildlife.
So we do have, and is it, Eric, is it?
100% accurate.
Okay.
That's correct.
Not being accurate, but are they pretty much geographically identifiable, or are they spread all over?
You can just walk down the street and you can pick them out pretty easy. 12th Street, that big tree in the middle of the road, I think that's an Oregon white oak, if I'm not mistaken.
So they're
You know where the Heritage Country project is going right now?
yes.
They used to have some lone, very large bulbous trees that were out there. Those were Oregon white oaks, similar ones over in Riverside right now. So they're pretty obvious. And I think the issue is not so much that we have oak habitat,
Okay.
large of an acre or more. I don't know of any in this community.
Right.
But so it's more individual trees or smaller clusters than that.
Right. And WFW has criteria on how they classify a woodland. And they can, if it was a large tree in a single oak in an urbanizing area, they could consider it to be valuable, but they might not. So just because there is one tree on a property doesn't mean it is protected.
So if it does come down, that just means, at some point, that means that somewhere on that property, then there'll be a planting of X number of trees to equal that out or whatever, or at some point, or?
The difficulty is when planning, building 7,500 square foot lots, and you're mass grading the site, which is what most of the time happens.
Yes.
There's not a lot of place to put an Oregon white oak that will grow to maturity.
That's for sure.
During your use of the property, most likely. And so one of the things that the city has considered over time is should there be a dedicated area, like a mitigation bank for wetlands, but an area where you could see a grove of oak trees develop over time and provide greater habitat value to it.
So that's an option then, potentially? In other words, it doesn't have to be necessarily on the property owner's own property. It could be planted in another area designated for this grove of trees?
Yeah, there
Potentially.
could be something set up like that where if the city identifies a location and an old property owner had to cut down 5 trees and they had to plant back, say 15,
Right.
or something like that.
Right.
That site could be open to go plant, but just be considered off-site mitigation.
Do we have such a thing? We don't, do we?
You do
I think so. If we have, I haven't heard of it. Okay.
We have
No, it's,
some-
okay, I like there's some flexibility there, though, isn't there?
Yeah, there's
Yeah,
flexibility.
we could design some into the code.
We have some pretty strange rules, apart from oak or anything else, about taking down a tree anywhere.
They're not part of the critical areas code.
No, but they're in,
They're not part of the critical areas code right now. You do have a tree protection ordinance, which is not under this part.
I understand, but I guess what I'm suggesting is, we have external of all this conversation, some rules of the city that are pretty
Yeah.
extreme on when you can take a tree down and
Right.
when you can't.
What you can
I'll leave it there. I'll just.
Great, but the code section exists. But it's not in this chapter.
Right, okay.
But, so that was really just,
Yeah.
something for you guys to think about, and maybe just provide guidance as we move forward. If you wanted to nominate or have oaks as like a area of a habitat of local importance, or just kind of keep it the way the current guidance or code interprets it. And then the next thing I wanted to bring up also is more of kind of a seeking guidance, and that refers to riparian buffers. So the current code suggests that McCormick Creek, Breezy Creek, and Jenny Creeks should have a wider buffer than what's stated in the table. And the table is on page 41 of the packet. Is that right?
There's no easy way to get to 41.
41 of 86.
If you use the little things on the side,
Yeah, I'm
if you do that, like,
there.
And so the current buffer width is 200 feet as noted in the code.
it's got these on the side.
Oh, it's,
But
Is
then
that,
the code also states that those creeks should have larger buffers. And it seems to present some conflict, and we were thinking that we could take that out. Unless you wanted to keep that in there, if those creeks, I can't remember off the top of my head right now, but I believe some of them are fish bearing, they might have salmon habitat. So for areas that have salmon, known salmon spawning areas or salmon habitat, you could have a larger buffer. So again, this is kind of a question to the commission. It presents some confusing language in the code, and we could take that out, or we could maybe clarify it a little bit further. So it's something to think about.
May I have a point there? I believe McCormick Creek, Breezy Creek, and Jenny Creek do have fish-bearing breaches on them. Jenny Creek, though, is a misnomer in the code. Jenny Creek is north and west of the city. If you expand out Pacific Highway, you'll intersect Jenny Creek, but the creek that's behind your house is called what? Is it your house?
Doug's house,
Doug's house?
Bob's.
Yeah, okay. That's
That's the one that goes through
Up here?
That's when it goes through your community.
I just want to get that
Well,
correct.
that's-
What's
the
that
one-
called?
Well, there's a trail out there
What's it
behind
called?
Jeff's house. I don't
There's
know.
also a creek there.
Jenny Creek is this one.
Oh,
One of
here.
the creeks by
It's
me.
this creek right here.
That's a tiny creek, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's fish bearing from this point on down.
Oh, I see.
But
Okay.
this is not Jenny Creek.
That's right.
It's Bolin Creek. I got it.
Boland, okay.
Oh, right, thanks.
And then
Is that the one that the bridge goes over on the walk, on the walk?
Yes, that's
Okay.
the headwaters of it. Oh,
Okay.
near the head of it.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
And so, yeah, here's the code provision right here. It says the city identifies Breezy, McCormick, and Jenny Creeks as being critical to anadromous fish and therefore requiring a larger buffer than those stated. But it doesn't provide any guidance on what those larger buffer widths should be. So that would be challenging for a homeowner. Like, well, what is it? You know, should it be 250, 205?
and challenging for the city
Challenging
as
for the
well.
city.
So I think there's a question here of interpretation about, does this particular code provision that Dusty just pointed out, is it saying that the city wants to regulate those with wider buffers than are already required in the table? Or is it saying that the buffers that are in the table are wider than the other streams? So there's a couple of different ways to interpret that, if that makes sense. So if you look at that sort of like third row down of the table, it says that those type F fish, one above that, type F fish-bearing streams have a 200-foot riparian buffer. That's wider than the streams below that, the type NP stream and the type NS stream. So is that what the code is saying?
Yes.
Or is the code saying we want to regulate these as being even more special and require an even larger buffer on them than is already stated in the table? So I think it's probably that it's trying to say that those are special creeks and that we're going to regulate them in accordance with the table. If that's the case, we would just recommend probably that you remove that provision because the table already states what the buffer has to be, so there's no point in stating that the buffer needs to be wider than that. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So that's the point of clarification. So if you agree with that, we'd like to just remove that provision that says that they require a larger buffer,
And just stick with the numbers that we have.
right? So people aren't
The
confused.
table just says it all.
Yeah.
Just keep it simple.
Yep.
Just for my education, where does the buffer, if it has a 100-foot buffer, is that from the edge of the stream 100 feet in both directions from both edges, or?
That's correct.
Okay.
It goes from bordering high and then land.
So it would have a 200-foot overall buffer if it had a 100-foot buffer,
Plus the width of the
plus the
stream.
width of the stream.
All right, now I'm going to switch gears over to wetlands. The first thing is the city's policy towards disturbance of wetlands. And this is on page 57. Sorry, I'm going to get this real quick. All right. So, the provision says the city may allow impacts to category 3 and 4 wetlands and wetland buffers if the mitigation area is owned by a homeowners association or a similar entity recognized by the city, and the city finds that accepting entity has the meaning and ability to inspect, monitor, and maintain, a minimum of 10 years. So, our interpretation of that code would mean that only homeowners associations or entities that are deemed to have the means and ability could impact category 3 and 4 wetlands. And that would seem to leave out maybe your single-family residences or industrial or commercial application landowners. And so we're kind of recommending either tweaking or deleting that provision so that you're not necessarily limiting any one person or entity to the ability to impact and mitigate for those impacts on wetland. So, with your approval, we kind of like to tweak or eliminate that provision to kind of make it fair for everyone to be able to have that.
More
ability.
generic then.
Yeah, more generic.
So, Justin, read that clause in context with sub 2. The city prohibits platting of privately held lots.
So the policy towards disturbance of wetlands and buffers. The city prohibits platting of privately held lots in wetlands and wetland buffers.
Right.
So that, the way I read that is that you would have to create a separate lot or tract to set aside the wetland and or the buffer, which is pretty typical throughout the state, I think, so to require if a developer was to come in and develop a parcel, they set aside the wetlands and wetland buffers in a tract.
So they draw separate lines on the paper for that area.
And you don't draw the lot lines through it per se. You want to kind of set it aside. And so, you know, were you meaning that this subset 4 is in relation to 2? Or?
Well, you were talking about a single-family homeowner, and so I was just wanting to make the point that that would be one of those pre-existing lots, because you're not going to set a new subdivision, creating lots in the wetland or in the wetland for some jurisdictions do. And the only way that if you do impact wetlands and wetland buffers, then you have to have a homeowner association. That applies to the developer, but it doesn't really apply to the single family.
Right.
Just want to make sure that's clear.
Yes. So the next point we want to talk about, it's still on 57, is that ecology is recommending not allowing impacts to category 1 and 2 wetlands. However, we don't necessarily agree with that recommendation from ecology, as their own guidance allows for impacts to category 1 and 2 wetlands. So it's just a point that we're not recommending that we comply with ecology's comment here, and it may come up again as we move forward with the review if you agree with our recommendation. Ecology will probably continue to comment on this, but like Ethan mentioned in the beginning, you're not obligated to use all of ecology's recommendations in drafting your ordinance.
I don't know whether I follow all of what you just said, but part of what you say is that ecology in its own guidance has some conflict.
With their recommendations.
They're suggesting one thing to us here, but there's something else.
And they reference Pacific County's ordinance as an example for this. So the Pacific County did do this, where they said that no one can impact category 1 and 2 wetlands. So they're saying, well, another county did it, you guys could do that as well. We're not recommending that. So just as I mentioned, ecology will probably continue to comment on this, but we don't have to do it.
So when we get back to them, will we be telling them about this
Yes.
difference too? Yeah.
In the past, Ethan and I have had conference calls with ecology because they'll comment again, and we'll explain to them the changes that we've made based on their comments and some of the edits that we did not make based on their comments. And this would be an example of one where we would say, well, your guidance actually doesn't require that in code, so we're not going to recommend it. We'll send you that.
Well, good luck with that.
So you, in effect, you are our arbitrator, even though they don't get a vote.
That's correct.
Is that, how does that affect us going forward, though, when they say, these are things we want to have in your code,
I
and
think
we
they
don't
keep
put those in?
commenting.
How does that affect other activity going forward outside of this code?
Like, do they hold a grudge?
There you go.
I don't think so. I mean, they
I mean,
can
are
take
they
beef with-
are they two different areas within ecology that deal with this, or are they brothers and sisters?
they're brothers and sisters. I don't think that they're going to hold a grudge against you and review, water quality certifications, which are what you need to get if you're going to be impacting a wetland from ecology. They're not going to suddenly review that in a different way or something because we didn't take their comment into account. But I think the concern with this provision here is that it's saying that impacts to category 1 and 2 wetlands are prohibited entirely. Well, the point of a critical areas ordinance is to protect critical areas by, number one, getting people to avoid impacting them. But if they can't avoid impacting them, then it sets up a process whereby they can impact them and mitigate for them and get permitted for that.
Right.
So if you say that you are prohibiting impacts to category 1 and 2 wetlands, you're basically taking away one of the main purposes of critical areas ordinances, which is to allow those kind of impacts when it's appropriate. So,
Sorry.
that's okay. And so Eric and I have had a discussion about this, and I think that's probably what he and Dusty are talking about right now. You could leave this in here and say that impacts to category 1 and 2 wetlands are prohibited, and what that would do then is require somebody to go get a critical areas variance, which is a higher level of review than a critical areas permit. So you could leave it in there. It doesn't mean that people absolutely couldn't impact category 1 and 2 wetlands, but it would be more difficult for them to impact it. They'd have to go get a critical areas variance to do that. So that's the distinction basically is review process. Do you allow people to impact category 1 and 2 wetlands through a critical areas permit, which is a type 2 process, staff administrative review, or do you leave this statement in there and require them to go get a critical areas variance, type 3 process, hearings, examiner review to impact a category 1 and 2 wetlands? So I think that's the essential distinction there, and I understand that it's been the city's long-standing policy not to allow impacts to category 1 and 2 wetlands and to do everything you can to discourage them. So it's just kind of a different.
Yeah.
And maybe a little more context, not to belittle the issue, but the 2014 wetland rating system that Ecology had put out and is now what is the standard across the state that should be used. We're finding that some wetlands that in the past may have been a category 3 wetland are now can meet that category 2 criteria. And so category 3 are generally lower quality, have had some impacts in the past. And now that they're changed the rating manual, if they get, for example, stormwater runoff from a road, now they're considered to have a higher value and then can sometimes jump to that category 2 wetland rating. But that shouldn't exclude someone from being able to impact it or have to go through that higher review process just because it's a category 2 wetland now.
Gotcha.
Who would issue the variance?
City.
So that'd still be the city? Okay.
So it's really a question to the commission about, do you want to keep it in there, require people to get a variance for impacts to category 1 and 2 wetlands, or do you want to remove that statement and then people could impact those wetlands through just a critical areas permit? So that's kind of the essential policy question for you to consider.
Eric, for simplicity and application and the like, do you have a preference?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
I tried to go back to Mr. Workman's questions. How many of these animals are there that are out there? I think context is important. Category 1, Dusty and I would correct me if I'm wrong. If you're thinking in your mind, well, what are these animals?
Yeah.
Think of the bottomlands.
Yeah.
Okay. Those are but that's where you may want to put a trail. Most of the lands in the county's jurisdiction, okay, and they do allow some impacts to category 1s. But those are probably where you're going to find the category 1s in this city. The only other category 2 that I know, and I wasn't familiar with what Dusty was just talking about, it's probably a category 2 is down over in the Riverside project where they have that pond and the oak tree. Well, that might be category 2 wetlands. So we don't have as many here just because of the topography that we have, but it is possible.
What category would be the large pond by the old Circle C there? If you look towards the freeway, there's a blue spot on our side. Yep,
Right here?
yep.
It's a man-made lake, basically.
So it's not a natural, it wouldn't be considered as like a one or,
There's a berm that goes across here. Yeah. So there's a stream that runs into it, it's impounded, the stream continues on this way. There might be like a little fringe wetland associated with that impoundment. It might need a category 2 status. But it's hard to say without doing the reading.
When you go back and now start tweaking the code, you've been talking about doing the tweaks, now you're gonna go back at some point and tweak that. So, when we get that back to look at, can we get that hard copy at some point, Eric? At some point, get that a hard copy of when it gets incorporated?
Ideally, what should happen is that they'll send the report when they finish it to Jeff and to Sarah, okay? And then you will get it a week, if you should get it a week.
A printed copy?
Cities, Jeff policy is to do everything electronically, they want printed copies.
We're gonna do it, no? Okay.
I'm not familiar.
Well, okay.
I usually print all my own, but I didn't have a chance.
Yeah,
I
there's 50
wrote-
pages here, I
Yeah.
didn't do that, but, so that when we get that back, though, it'll be pretty obvious, and you'll be identified that these are the pieces that you've tweaked.
We can do that.
Because I think based on what you said, Eric, the preponderance of the code will not change.
I know I want to have a printed copy, just because after my experience with the shoreline management plan, where we had to go through 200 pages every week because of changes ecology sent down to us for 2 years, I don't want us to be going through that process forever.
Yeah. Anyways,
I look at this a little differently. I look at it as them being a very good buffer for us
Oh.
to not have to do all of that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I don't want to have.
Because I remember doing it
Oh,
pretty clearly.
yeah, we do.
I know this is off topic, but what do we have to do to ensure that we receive something, Eric, like that for review a week before the meeting? For example, this last packet we got at almost 5 p.m. on Friday. So here we are at the meeting today on Tuesday. I know this is off topic, but that week that you're talking about sounds really good. I just never see it. We usually get, 2, 3, maybe 4 days.
I can tell you that everything that these gentlemen prepared and that I prepared was in the city's hands by Tuesday.
Okay.
Why it didn't go out till Friday, I don't know. I share your concern about it.
Okay.
a little administrative thing.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. We're getting close to being done with these. The next one, I think is important, and Ecology commented, and I think on the city's behalf on this, is if we look at wetland delineations in the code, and then section C, responsibility. And the delineation is the responsibility of the applicant, and that should be, but then it says the city shall verify the accuracy of the boundaries within 20 working days, so receiving the delineation report. That puts the city, I think, in a little bit of risk, because if you don't have staff, city staff that are considered to be wetland biologists, and then you don't have anyone to go look at those boundaries and verify them, you're not actually meeting what the code says is your responsibility. So I think our recommendation would be to remove that, or keep the 20, that the city will verify within 20 working days. I'm not sure if we have a suggestion of what it should say at this point, but
I think that the review process that a critical areas permit is attached to, whether that's a subdivision or conditional use permit or something like that, should be the regulating time frame by which critical areas permits and wetland delineations are reviewed. So I don't really think it's necessary, in my opinion, to have a period of time by which the city's going to get back to the applicant, because that automatically happens as part of the critical areas permit and review process.
When would it be good for the citizen to know that the city will start the process within a certain amount of time then, rather than complete the process within a certain amount of time?
The way that the code's set up for land use applications is we have certain timelines we have to meet. And so, in many respects, this is at odds with those timelines. So I would prefer to have you just rely on the adopted code timelines for when we have to find an application complete, when we have to schedule a hearing, when we have to issue a report, those kinds of things. But I think Dusty's absolutely right. There's no expertise right now in this community professionally to evaluate and to verify any of these reports. And so what we do is we look at it and we prepare the SEPA document and we send it out, and Ecology is asking for the critical areas reports regularly now. And we send it off to them, and then they give us comments within the 14-day comment.
You said at odds, that means they're more stringent?
I'm sorry?
You say at odds with, I understand different, but more stringent in this document?
I think at odds that we have a 28 days to find the application complete. And then once we find it complete, we've got 2 or 3 weeks, I forget which, in order to get the hearing or the public notice out. And right now, we've got 20 days here in order to verify a delineation. We literally can't do it.
So just getting back, the other way it works, when complete, so when you have complete documents and all of that,
Right.
then the clock begins to toll.
And the clock starts ticking.
On this, it's not written that tightly or that,
Correct.
so to me, it seems obvious that it should
It's
go.
just simply
It should
said,
go.
once we receive the delineation, we have to verify it in 20 days. A, we don't have 20 days, and B, we don't have the expertise to verify.
Right.
But other than that, it's easy.
That's fine.
All right, and then I think the last issue, there might be a couple bullets, all relating to wetland buffers. And I think Ethan and I can kind of attest that buffer widths can be a hot topic. Because we want to look at it from both sides. We want to make sure that the city is using best available science and providing protective measures for the wetlands, but not maybe not going too far and having very large encumbering buffers that can be a burden for some property owners, but at least with not having some ability to reduce those buffers. So the next 3 items kind of all are related to wetland buffers. And these are the current buffer tables in the code. So there's the 4 categories of wetlands, and then there's intensity of land use, and this is the proposed intensity. So if you, to use a single-family residence example again, depends on the number of residences within a certain area. So it's like a lot per acre kind of standard, and that would determine if it's a low, moderate, or high intensity. So your residential developments are going to be high intensity, and you would have a 100-foot buffer off of a category 1 wetland, 1, 2, but a 50-foot buffer off of a category 4 wetland, where if it's a 5-acre lot, it would be a 25-foot buffer.
Just for clarification, almost every use proposed in the city is high intensity.
Okay.
It's
good enough.
It's urban level development, so it's all high intensity unless you're building a park.
So
And the definitions for the use is in there somewhere to review after this before we, okay.
anyway, Ecology is recommending going to their buffer tables, which increase the buffer widths significantly. I think everything would be like a category 3, or sorry, a 300-foot buffer for category 1 to wetlands, and there's not any flexibility based on the score that the wetland receives from the habitat rating form. So, not to get too technical, there's a bunch of scores you get, and the overall score determines whether or not you get a category 1, 2, 3, or 4 wetland. So the higher the number, the better quality or higher quality wetland. So Ecology is recommending they use their buffer tables, but I think Ethan would probably agree that it doesn't provide as much flexibility for the potential applicant. So again, we're not recommending we move in that direction. It may be an issue that Ecology keeps commenting on. But we can continue to have this discussion about buffers, because in our experience, this comes up quite a bit. You have a question?
Question, Eric, the north side of Foothill Estates, those homes, that Bowling Creek, were determined that's Bowling Creek going there, heading east-west there, behind those properties.
Yes.
I know that they're not allowed to go into, even though so many feet of their property is actually in the, their lot is actually in that protected area. That's what we're talking about, is it not? To some level here?
Yes, in part. So what you're saying is an illustration of a problem that the city identified back when that subdivision was created, because the city allowed platting of lots in the buffer areas at the time. And the city ran into a tremendous amount of pushback from property owners who said, but it's my lot.
Right.
I can't regulate it. Why do I have a trail there? Why do I have to have a fence here? So on and so forth. And so several years back, I don't know when it was, but several years ago, I was here earlier, the city said, no, we're not going to allow platting in wetland buffers anymore. Code doesn't necessarily say riparian buffers, I think it should. But, so that's the first part of the question.
Okay.
The second part of the question then is, what's the actual buffer itself?
Okay.
And that depends upon the ecology scores and habitat values and so on and so forth. And so the higher the buffer, the bigger the buffer, the less land there is for development. What a lot of developers do, though, is they'll say, well, we're going to give you a 7,500 square foot lot. This is in other jurisdictions. But only 4,000 square feet of it is in a wetland buffer. You can't use it.
Eric, does, in the case, I guess 90% of the properties along Bowling Creek that are on there have fences that block, that don't go into that protected area. Not all of them, some of them. So is there a requirement that somehow that's on a piece of property, that the area that is, quotes, protected is somehow identifiable?
It's on the plat for that subdivision.
Is
It
it so?
shows that that buffer area is a conservation area.
So somehow, how does a property owner required to put up some kind of a,
That subdivision, if I remember, required fencing. And I know that the plat does have that line across it. Whether the homeowner ever looked at that when they bought the property is another question altogether.
right?
And that's why the city said we're not going to do that anymore, because it's creating too many troubles. But who's responsible to maintain it? I believe the city's responsible to maintain that trail.
Right.
Because I think it's part of the city trail
Right,
system.
it is.
But Ecology is recommending a buffer that's 3 times what we have right now.
I don't think it's 3 times,
What is
because as I was mentioning, everything in the city is a high value, high intensity.
For the old,
If
what's
you're
it?
going to put in a park with an open play area, that's probably a low intensity use. I think even Dusty and I have had conversations about golf courses in the past. Whether it's low intensity or medium or high. But any residential development in this city is going to be high intensity.
I'm guessing Ecology is making this recommendation without any specific problem in La Center?
That's correct.
Property in La Center, or
That's correct.
any particular knowledge on how it's worked out in the last 10 or 15 years?
I haven't received criticism.
So why would we change what we have?
Yeah, I agree with Ray.
And maybe just to point out the differences here. So this is on the right, this is what ecology is recommending. And so if you look at the high intensity uses and what you're currently allowing under category 1 and 2 wetlands, you have basically the same 100 to 300 for high intensity. But you're not getting some of the flexibility by having the different habitat scores. So someone might have a high intensity with a 6 and 120 foot, but here it's recommending 150. So again, I think it provides some flexibility for the applicant to be able to have a different, possibly a different buffer width. It could still have the 300, which is what ecology is recommending for 8 or 9, but it could have 260 if it doesn't need to. And like
Numbers are habitat values.
yes, these are habitat scores right here. So it's not a huge difference from what you're currently using, but I think just what you have right now allows for more flexibility for it.
So simplicity in this case is not necessarily better.
That's true.
Yeah.
And from the council standpoint, I think they would appreciate the existing level of flexibility.
Yes,
It
for
exists.
sure.
Good.
I think you're tracking right with us here,
All right.
at least for the most part.
So 2 final issues to talk about, and I want to go back down to page 61. So there is one. Comment from ecology about so the code has the ability to average buffer widths. So if you have the 300 foot buffer and you wanted to average it, you could extend the buffer out, and then you could reduce it in another area, but it has to equal out 1 to 1. So if you reduced it by 2,000 square feet in one area, you have to add 2,000 square feet in another area. But what ecology is saying is that they want to limit the reduction to just within the outer 25%. And that's based on their best available science. And so I'll do an easier example. If it was a 100-foot buffer, you could only encroach into the 75-foot line from the buffer, from the wetland, and then extend that area out past 100 feet in another area. And we're, on this comment, we're actually recommending that because that is kind of a specific case that ecology has shown. They've done a lot of research on this and they have a lot of science to back up their justification. So in our mind, it's probably one of those areas we recommend accepting the comment, but it's up for discussion.
I think if it makes sense and is backed by the science, and you've checked that, and we can't disagree with everything they're saying, that's not a real good policy.
Yeah, right. It doesn't work real well.
When do we give them this one? You save our arrows.
I think that makes sense. You're saying you want to keep a minimum of 75% of that buffer.
That's correct.
You wouldn't want to have somebody like with a 10-foot buffer here and a 500-foot buffer, down the stream, because then the 10-foot just isn't enough.
Right. And the code allows for other avenues of reduction, but this is just specific to the averaging example. So we wanted to point that out. And then the next comment, also on page, I guess on 62. Deals with the buffer reduction criteria. And so again, ecology commented on the 25% reductions consistent with best available science. We think there's kind of a patchwork of buffer reduction criteria in different sections of the code, and we're kind of recommending consolidating and streamlining those buffer reduction measures. Kind of with how your overall comment before about if we can eliminate some of the confusion in the language. This is one of those examples where we would try to craft some language that consolidates the different types of reduction measures that are available to an applicant, just make it maybe more user-friendly. So we don't really have that code drafted, but that would be the next step. So we would look at streamlining this, present it to you the next time, you can review it, see if you agree with what we've crafted, maybe we need to tweak it a little bit, but that's what we're recommending at the time.
And some of that would be in some form of a table, potentially.
Potentially, yeah, we could look at putting a table in that highlights the code and the different avenues.
We like tables in some degree.
All right.
It sounds like it would also
It just-
reduce the impact of possible litigation or something, somebody, if what exists is confusing.
Yes, that's true, yeah.
True.
So that wraps up kind of things I'd like to highlight, and Ethan, I don't know if you have anything else to add?
So we'll come back to you next month with a revised code. We'll clearly highlight the things that we changed, and so you can see that right in front of you. And we'll talk through some of those things again. We'll highlight everything that we changed and probably only talk through some of them, kind of like we did this. But that, I think, will sort of get us to the next stage, which will be, do you agree or not agree with this change, and then we can go from there.
Does that code that you're going to bring back to us go through a pre-screening with you, Eric?
Not in this particular case.
Not in this particular case, okay.
Because I won't be around for the next 2 meetings.
Okay.
So when do you want the answers to the guidance questions from the discussion tonight to incorporate into that draft? Tonight?
You haven't, you have some
We have a lot
feedback
of the guidance.
already.
I think if there's anything that's, if you wanted to think about it, maybe a week, Ethan, or no, we have.
Yeah, that's plenty of time. I mean, if you wanted to take the next week to give us some thoughts on some of the guidance questions, then that would be fine, and you could email us, and Jeff knows how to get a hold of me or things like cards.
So send an email to Jeff, and Jeff will forward it.
So it looks like the guidance questions that I had from tonight were, do we want to put an increase in protection on the oak trees? Did we want to increase the buffer for fish bearing areas, or salmon spawning areas?
Which I think we answered as a no in that case. I think we moved past that, because that was the use the table or use the provision instead of delete. So I think that was
Okay.
the answer.
Do we want to remove the statement to allow for all and not just HOA to be
We answered that.
able to prove to impact 3 and 4 type? Did we answer that?
Yeah, I
I
think
thought
we
we
did.
did.
With a head nod or something?
Well,
Okay.
I think
Yeah,
it's a little more firm than that.
I understood it to be that we move forward with not limiting it to the homeowners.
Yeah, I
Right,
think that's
right.
my recollection.
Level playing field somewhat.
The simplicity too.
Yeah.
And do we want to keep it so that there can be a variance for impacting 1 and 2, or do we just not want to prohibit impacts and keep it at a category 2, or do we want to move that to the category 3 approval process?
I think that was an open question.
Okay. And then we are going to eliminate the city having to verify within 20 days.
Yes.
Going along with what you just said there regarding variances, I've not read this code. And so, is there, though, in there provisions for an applicant to get a variance on various aspects of the code? Is that pretty well clear in there? That's one of the things I think, I can't say it's in there, but hopefully it is, because we've come up with that in a number of other different situations. Not that we're anticipating them, but the fact that we're providing a proviso for that possibility, I think is something I would like to see us take a look at and make sure it's clear that there are circumstances that might come up that could be mitigated through going through council or staff or whatever. There may be some variance allowables to the code, so.
Yeah, the 18300-060 there's a section for variances.
Okay. I just think we'll probably scrutinize that one part of it.
It's been in the code. That section's been there for.
And you're satisfied with that way that's written too, as far as you're concerned?
Nobody's ever requested.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I don't anticipate it either.
Those are pretty typical variance
Okay.
criteria and process, so I don't see a
Yeah.
huge need to revise that.
So what do we have outstanding? The trees?
You have the trees and then the impacts to category 1 and 2 wetlands. Do you want to continue to require a variance for impacting category 1 and 2 wetlands, or do you want to just make that a regular critical areas permit?
And your recommendation on that second one?
I mean, our initial recommendation was to go ahead and state that we remove that provision and allow for impact to category 1 and 2 wetlands, because that's consistent with ecology guidance. But I think in further discussion, really, it's a distinction in process again. So it's, do you want a critical areas permit a little bit easier, or do you want to require people to go through a critical areas variance? Either one will get you, will allow impacts to category 1 and 2 wetlands. It's just how high do you want somebody to have to jump to get there. And so, as discussed, it sounds like there's very few of those category 1 and 2 wetlands in town. One would be the La Center bottomlands, and then there was a category 2 possibly mentioned, and so we're not talking about very many cases here, but, so.
If we just left it alone, we wouldn't.
If you left it alone, it would require a variance.
For 1 and 2, that would be a small subset of potential applicants. I might make the recommendation of only, but if you wanted to keep it, just make it category 1 wetlands. And then category 2 through 3 could be the type 2 process. If you wanted to go that way.
To add a level of protection for the bottoms area,
Right.
or difficulty, a level of difficulty
Little
to change.
difficulty, You just have to go to that next type 3.
Makes sense.
You spent a lot of time in the last year talking about how important the bottoms are,
Yeah, we sure have.
and
Yeah.
that's where the category 1
Yeah.
is most likely.
Yeah.
So why don't
I
we
like
go-
that
Why
idea.
don't we go with it?
Okay.
At least the first cut through.
Can we get a resolution on the trees at all?
Yeah, it'd be
My
great to
view-
get the answers tonight instead of emailing
Yeah,
them. with
well,
them.
my view of that from just, I know we're talking two separate processes, but based on laws or rules that exist within the town, you have to go through hell to be able to take down a tree. So I don't know whether you need a whole other level to protect yourself there. I don't see what the gain would be based on the existing municipal guidance, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, it would just be, so they're already protected to some degree by WDFW if they meet certain requirements, usually over 1 acre in size, but within the urban areas, it can be less than.
Could be a single tree.
It could be a single tree that's large enough.
Yeah.
We don't really identify what that quality level is.
You have to have potentially have a fish and wildlife biologist come to the site and review it. So.
Who has to do that?
So the landowner would, if he went to this, currently, if there are oaks on the property and they're maps, and the city recommends that they hire, correct me if I'm not here, if you hire a consultant to verify the mapping by GIS, and then the consultant finds that there's one tree, but it's a big one, but it may or may not meet the criteria that WFW has, then you may need to get the biologist, the applicant would need to get the biologist on site to determine is it or is not needing to be regulated.
And WDFW would probably have to concur with that.
That's what I mean with
Would they actually
WFW.
do written concurrence on a single oak? Not from my experience.
Not necessarily. But again, it's just, what I'm trying to iterate is that there would be, there currently is already a process to go through. So making them a habitat of local importance, we'll just add another layer.
Okay.
We
My
don't
point
need-
is that based on the existing rules the city has, just to give you an example,
But they have nothing to do with this code.
I understand that, but there's still trees, right? So I planted some trees. They got too big. I wanted to take a couple down. They're spruce trees, common tree. I got the whole process to do that. And I just don't see the advantage. If that process exists, I don't see why you need another
Yeah, we don't need
more
another layer.
stringent process just for oaks. It's more stringent than the process that exists for oaks at present.
My recommendation would be because the oaks have recognized habitat value
Yeah,
as part of best available science rules, and a single spruce tree doesn't, get rid of the draconian rules that you're chafing under regarding spruce trees, and protect the true trees that have habitat value, protect the oaks. That would be my recommendation.
I'm not chafing under it. I mean, I've solved my problem, but I'm just saying, why have something that exists for one particular species that's already there and then notch it up a couple of levels to make it more stringent? I just don't see.
There must be some kind of added value of the oak compared to the other trees.
Oh, there's no question about that.
That's
No
why
question
they're
about that.
regulated in the critical
Right,
areas.
whereas the single spruce isn't, and so.
No, I understand that
Chafing
part.
under is that the city tree protection code, which is hardly ever enforced, unfortunately it was on you, I guess.
No,
It
no,
was
well,
6 inches or 8 inches diameter of breast height, any tree, okay?
Wow.
All right, that's in chapter 18-350. The single white oak is going to be a tree that has more substance, more value, because it has, actually it's identified by the state as potentially valuable habitat tree. And so I would argue that there's less regulation protecting the oak tree than there is protecting your 6-inch spruce.
You'd have to have a much larger oak
You'd
than
have to have much
6 or 8
larger oak.
inches to be regulated,
Yeah.
whereas a regular tree, 6 or 8 inches.
so you think we should go with a more stringent approach to,
I think there's more value in protecting Oregon white oaks than there is a single spruce tree in the yard.
well, I have no disagreement with that,
Yes.
but enough additional value to recommend changing the language that's there, do you think?
Their habitat for western gray squirrels, which is a threatened species under, if I'm not mistaken, the state of Washington.
Yes.
The squirrels that live in my backyard live in an alder tree.
They're not western gray squirrels.
Are you sure? Because they look like
I've
a
never
big
been
fluffy
here.
one. And then the owls in our place, they seem to live in the cedar or the fir trees. Is it something that if we're going to go to the level of protection for the oak, then we just do a full sweep and we say, hey, we might also want to protect western red cedar and big leaf maple at the same time or something like that? Is there a reason we're just going for the oak? I just don't understand how just the oak came.
The issue is that the oaks are specifically classified by WFW as priority habitat.
And the reason is that they're such a slow-growing species.
Right.
Western red cedar, spruce, Doug firs, big leaf maples, they grow up pretty quickly. But, those large diameter oak trees could be 200, 400, 600 years old. And it just takes a long time to get that large. They're also kind of a fire species. So if you look, for example, on the east side of the Cascades, you have a lot of oak trees growing, and there's no fire that's come through and maybe killed off some of them, so they're all being stunted. And with fire probably not really an issue in the city of the center, you don't really get a lot of regeneration or elimination of some of the smaller trees. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that they are a species that aren't as common as some of those other species you mentioned, and because of the nature of the way they grow, they don't get as large. So the large ones that are around probably do warrant more protection than some of the other species.
So you feel that we should go with additional I'm just trying to get it to a conclusion so you don't have to
Right.
draft it 6 times.
I think if you might have a better, greater sense of what the community would think, but there are communities that value oak trees and they have protected them as a locally important habitat. And I think there is value in that, but
Okay, I'm
maybe
sold.
it's not for the
I'm
site.
sold. I hope everybody, I'm sold with the idea.
In here, when you say critical area, just kind of layman's understanding, it seems like it would be a wetland or something like that. And I'm looking at the critical definition here in the ordinance, and it follows that basically. It says wetlands, critical aquifer, recharge areas, streams, fish and wildlife habitat, conservation areas, frequently flooded areas, and geologically hazard areas. So would somebody having a single oak tree that's covered by this ordinance, I don't think you would know from this definition that that was part of it.
You have to go look at the WDFW guidance that talks about what type of oak trees are priority habitat, and then the habitat biologist would have to come out on site, correct me if I'm wrong, Misty.
Well, I think to answer his question, they are regulated under the Fish and Wildlife Habitat Conservation section of the code. So if you go to that section of the code, that code says that priority habitats, or these fish and wildlife habitats are streams, riparian areas, priority habitats and species identified by the state,
With oaks being one of those.
oaks being one of them, and there's a few other things that they also list.
So, would the oak be considered wildlife habitat? Is that where it would
Yeah,
fit in?
it's a
Okay.
type of fish and
Oh,
wildlife
all right.
habitat.
Thanks for your guys' patience while we work through this.
No problem. Glad to have a discussion.
But I don't want to belabor the point, but since I'm not going to be here next week, I'd like to just, next month, I just want to mention 3 policy questions we haven't really talked about
Okay.
for your consideration. One I've already briefly touched on, and that is the wetland platting of new single-family lots and new subdivisions. It's not allowed in wetland buffers. Ethan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it's crystal clear that you're not allowed to do that in riparian buffers as well.
I believe that's true. I didn't
So,
see-
just for consistency within the code, you're not allowing brand new subdivisions and wetland buffers. The argument would still be the same thing for the riparian buffers, because there's been some confusion as to whether the code covers it or not. So that's one. The second thing is just a personal observation of years working for cities, monitoring or reading monitoring reports. And so Ecology is recommending a guidance of 5 years, and WSP, who in my respect, is recommending that it could be as much as 10 years. From an administrative perspective, one, we rarely get the reports, the monitoring reports. And two, 10 years will tell you more and give you more information than 5 years worth of monitoring. But when the monitoring doesn't really happen on a regular basis and we don't get the reports, 10 years is overkill, honestly, because nobody's going to do it. That's just an administrative perspective. And Dusty, I know you maybe have a different perspective on this, but I've heard a number of people in your profession say, the developer's not paying us to write the reports, and the city doesn't even read them if they do write the reports.
No, I agree. I think that's pretty common. I think specific to wetlands, if there was a wetland fill, and you had to get a Corps permit, Corps of Engineers permit, ecology permit, there's a minimum 5 years, more likely 10 years required by those agencies. And those agencies have staff to do some of the enforcement, or at least call and nag, so to speak, that you haven't submitted your monitoring report, you're not in compliance. But I understand that cities don't have that luxury. They don't have staff dedicated to that, and it could be definitely overkill when you're not getting them and don't have the enforcement ability. So I sympathize with what you're saying on that.
And there's just one other point, and this is just totally personal. My attitude about impacts to critical areas.
is that if those areas are protected because they have some value in the community, whether it's for habitat value or open space or whatever it is. And if we allow the impacts to those resources and we lose the value, whatever they might be, of those resources, and then we allow the developer basically to go buy credits at the mitigation bank, you get no value out of the mitigation whatsoever. You had a resource, it's been impacted, and now the developer has mitigated it by buying credits at banks somewhere else. It's very, very common. Ecology is recommending that as a strategy. But from my perspective, if one of the tools that you have to improve your environmental quality is to require some improvements and mitigation efforts within your own community, so that you make it a better place. But if you simply allow credits to be purchased off-site, you get no value.
What does off-site mean? Outside of the city? Anywhere?
Anywhere, well, it depends. I mean, we've had conversations about this in the past too. Whether it means anywhere along the East Fork of the Lewis River, or does it mean specifically at the Fargo Lake Mitigation Bank? And more developers are actually just buying credits at the Fargo Lake Bank. It's expensive, but it gets you in and out of the process so much faster. The community gets no value out of it.
And from an ecology standpoint, it all comes out in the wash, but not for the individual city.
Statewide,
Statewide.
it's a wash.
So I would just encourage you to think about what's the purpose of mitigation from a local perspective as well.
Is
Could we-
it unheard of to require the mitigation to be within the city limits or on that very property that was mitigated, or?
There's problems with doing just that, but well, go ahead, you start.
Well, I was just gonna say, we have that experience on project, and so the city code, is it still that way?
Yes.
Yeah, so currently the city code requires on-site mitigation, and it could continue to do that, and maybe we can craft the language to allow for the bank use after exploring all on-site alternatives. Doing mitigation on-site first to provide that benefit to the community, but.
On-site meaning on the property that's
on
being
the
developed?
property, or maybe
Or-
within the city limits,
Oh.
if there's another parcel that is available, that could be an option. And then if the applicant has explored all those options and there's just not a feasible way, then there's the ability to go to the bank to compensate for those effects.
But going to the bank would be the easiest way for them to handle their problem.
That's true.
So they might say,
Don't write a check.
I've been exploring this for the last 3 weeks, but this is it, and they might have done nothing.
Right.
And I've heard that, yes.
Okay.
And what are we anticipating to see in the draft next time in regards to that policy?
I mean, since the existing code seems to favor on-site mitigation, that seems to be kind of what I'm hearing as the consensus. We can keep it
Preference.
that way, maybe tweak it a tiny bit to say that as a second alternative somewhere else in the city.
And the third alternative being an approved mitigation bank.
Well, if you left out the third one, if you just went to the first two and then just said, anything beyond this will need the approval of, if you word it in such a way that it doesn't focus it as a solution to easily drift to.
We could, I mean, we could require a variance for purchasing.
Just think it through.
Beyond category 2, you've got to get approved variance or something.
And I'm not trying to circumvent the state rules that allow this to happen. I think it's allowable. I just would like you to think about trying to get value here first. And so
Absolutely, I appreciate it.
the first thing that people have to do is identify a location on site. Nothing's available, and that sometimes does happen. Then identify a location within the immediate watershed within the city limits, which might be a possibility.
Right.
And then go on, and then it might be improvements in the bottomlands. And then from there, it might be up to the bank, mitigation bank. But I think just a protocol of analysis would be a good step to show.
I like that.
I think it makes
But
sense.
again, they still have the right to go to the bank under the state rules.
Understanding that a tree
We don't
150
make
miles
it
away
make
from
it
here is
easy
going to
for
help
them.
us.
They have the right to go to the bank even if we don't allow it in our code.
That's where I'm finding some legal concerns.
Mm.
Right,
Okay.
because the federal, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the state would prefer applicants to purchase from a bank. Because what they're finding, probably what cities are finding, is that when you do require the on-site mitigation, it's not being done, or if it is being done, it fails. And then you have a pocket of all these little areas that were supposed to compensate for impacts, but they're not. And I think there is some value in a bank that consolidates everything and provides, you have a bank operator who has to ensure that the bank is succeeding before he can get credits, he or she can get credits released. And they have to continue to show annual improvements to get credits released for the following year. So they're more on the hook, I guess, so to speak, than maybe a developer or a landowner would be. So on the flip side, not that I want to disagree with you, but I do think there is some value, and I know that the agencies will comment on that as well.
So the value is that there's a better chance of the mitigation actually being carried out successfully.
Correct.
In the bank.
And I don't disagree with Dusty. And I think that the point I was making about the monitoring reports not being submitted, even if they are not being read and followed through at the local level, is good proof of what it's saying right there. But if we just go at the first stop in the store is to go right to the bank, you've automatically cut out
Yeah, that's-
the opportunity to do something better.
So we'd like to see that phased out,
Yeah.
step 1, step 2, step 3, and then last resort.
Okay.
It sounds like the flip side of that is to retain the value is to somehow put more control over the impacts in the first place so that you don't lose the existing value. Do you have a recommendation, Eric, on something that we should propose to be included here that would help us to retain the value or protect it beyond what's already being done here?
I'm struggling with that, Jeremy, because most of the time in the development projects that I see, the habitat value is pretty well destroyed. Probably, just think about some of the newer subdivisions, they basically were farmlands. And
Right.
so they have very low habitat value. And so what are we actually losing there? Not much, which is why I'd rather see compensation put back into the stream reach next to the property or something like that. So I don't really have a good answer for you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we just have to come up with an answer to not be perfect.
Yeah, I mean, to get to the issue that you're talking about in terms of protecting the resource initially, I mean, certainly you could get tougher, I guess, if you wanted to, and require developers to preserve critical areas unless they, for instance, can't even achieve the minimum code required densities or something like that. In other words, a developer may propose a subdivision that maxes out density or gets close to maxing out density, but then also be making a case that the critical areas have to go away. Well, if you were building at a lesser density, or you were clustering the density away from the critical areas, you wouldn't have to impact them.
Oh, I like that train of thought.
Most jurisdictions won't get that tough. I mean, but that's something that you could do. You're raising the risk that they might challenge you, that they might challenge the city back and say, well, you're taking my development rights and my property rights from me. But in most cases, I think Eric would back me up on this.
long as
They
they-
usually, developers will usually want it both ways. They want to be able to maximize the amount of density. This is speaking a little bit in generalities, but they want to be able to maximize the development potential of their site because that gets them the greatest amount of profit and so forth, which is understandable, and that's the business that they're in. But if they do that, they're also increasing the chance that the critical areas are impacted. So you could say that you could provide more protection for those critical areas that are already there by saying you can't impact those critical areas, or you can only impact a certain percent or something like that. If you're proposing maximum density or a certain percent of maximum density.
So the center is basically 40 units an acre, except for the living density here, so it's 7,500 square foot lots. That's the density that's in this, the center's residential code. So, if you were to say, we will allow you to increase your density, 6 units an acre, let's say, the trade-off the city then makes is that, okay, developer, if you protect all the critical areas and buffers, as the code says, without any variances or adjustments, we'll allow you to bump up your density, hypothetically 2 units an acre, which means that you would see subdivisions, if people bought on that lure, you'd see subdivisions with less than 7,500 square foot lots. You'd see 6,000 square foot lots, perhaps.
And that's already,
400.
right?
You have the density transfer, so yeah, you could use that density transfer to make that happen, but the density transfer only allows you to have X percent at 6,000 square feet. So you have to tweak that a little bit in order to make it attractive. I mean, basically, it's a give and take, it's a sales job that we're doing here.
But what you're saying is rather than use the stick, which is what I was
Right.
saying, you're saying use the carrot, which I think is probably ultimately a better idea. You could increase the incentive for them to preserve those critical areas by saying, if you do that, you can have more density elsewhere on the site.
Well, I just have 2 quick questions for that, but before, is that something we want him to try to draft into that, or are we,
I like that.
do we
I think it's
try
a
to
challenge
consider
write
that
it.
in the writing?
Yeah, maybe not easy to write, but yeah.
Let's see what they can come up with.
I guess my 2 questions are, the current protection are just those buffers, right, for the wetlands, but then we're saying critical areas, but, so then I guess my ultimate question, Eric, is about that, how do you add that level of protection? Is that why you're telling us about the riparian buffers, as if they need to be included at an equal level as the wetland buffers, and that will help us retain the value?
Yes.
And the riparian buffers are the areas that provide the foliage near the waters, the streams and stuff, right? Right.
They cool, well, that's a little better, but they shade, they cool,
shade,
they protect habitat value, they're corridors for wildlife to move up and down.
So I think it would be to our benefit to include the riparian, and as long as in with the wetland. Do you guys agree with that at all?
Don't we?
Do we have language in there?
Do we already have that? I'm a little slower sometimes. I don't.
Do we have,
Crystal clear.
Well, so we brought up the table that showed the buffer widths for riparian areas based on the stream typing. And so that was when we were kind of talking about Breezy and Jenny. Jenny's not in
No,
it.
maybe we'll.
Yeah. And McCormick. And those have current buffer widths. But I think what Eric is saying is that the code doesn't say that lots cannot be plotted in riparian areas. And so we need to tweak the code to exclude the ability to put lot lines within the riparian area.
Okay, but the buffers for riparian are already included in this. Okay,
Okay,
So we can make that adjustment.
so that's clear.
thank you.
Okay.
So I think the other unanswered guidance pieces that I had written down, just to clarify, to make sure we get it right for these guys, is that are we going to adopt the ecology's buffer system or keep our current, or modify our current? We're going to keep our current, correct?
Yes.
And then were we going to adopt the 25% limit for when they average the buffer? We were going to say
I
yes
think
to the
so.
25%?
I thought that's what you recommended.
That's what we're
That's
recommending.
Are we going to change the 10-year monitoring to 5 years? Did we decide that was our
I
goal?
thought that conversation went, they weren't giving us the reports anyway, so it didn't
And what does it say today, 10 or 5?
5, right?
I think it's agenda.
And we can leave it at 5, the college is recommending 10.
Doesn't hurt us, does it?
I've read 2 in the last 6 years.
So if you changed it to what ecology wanted, you'd be
That's right.
giving them one thing that they wanted.
There you go.
And it doesn't have any impact anyway, right?
Yeah. Let's
Give it to them. Let's give it to them.
I mean, I don't want to be,
Let's do the 10 years?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's do the 10 years.
Is that 2 things we've given them now?
well,
So I guess the only other thing that we haven't answered for these guys is we want to increase the protection of the oak, or did we answer that?
well,
I just want to give them clear,
I went along, I thought, yeah, that was my view of it. I ultimately supported the idea of the increased
are
protection.
there other opinions on that?
I'm okay to protect it. The only thing I want to see when the final language is there is the fact that I want to protect, that's first, I want to protect the oak for sure. But there are going to be circumstances potentially where an oak is going to have to get removed. Want to make sure we got provisions for that resident to be able to do that satisfactorily without going through spending $1 million, you know, whatever that is. And make sure that we got some clear provisions in there so that doesn't somehow stop his project or help stop him building on his property. We've given him some ways of him to taking it down. It says, okay, if you take it down, then you got to do this, this, and this. You know, and we got provisions to do that. You got this, you step here, you go to here, you go to here. You know, here's some things you could do. We may actually have, at some point, I don't know if this is worth discussion at some point with the council or whatever along the way, is the idea of having within the city our own plot of trees where we can actually put trees and create our own oak tree mitigation,
Yeah.
whatever. I mean,
That's an interesting idea.
and we've certainly got property in the city that belongs to the city, probably that could be used even as we speak for that.
I'm not going to suggest this.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to say, but there are places on hillsides, south-facing hillsides in this community right now that are dedicated open spaces that could become oak habitat, which are larger than an acre or more, which could
Yeah.
become a habitat.
And we've got parks within our city that could certainly accommodate oak trees.
The one thing that I'd like to see, though, along your line of reasoning is that we need to provide the property owner with a mitigation ratio. We have mitigation ratios for everything else.
Right.
So he can provide a recommendation as well. If you're going to take down an oak of X size, science says we want X number of trees planted,
Yeah.
either on site or in a park
Right.
or somewhere else.
Exactly.
That's so that they know there's some certainty in the developer's mind what the burden is.
Is
Absolutely.
that what we want, or do we want to say don't touch the oak at all?
No, I think there's going to be circumstances where the oak's a property owner wants to build and the oak's going to be in his way. As long as we
I have
do
no
it
problem with that.
properly.
We cut down a white oak and milled it 2 years ago, and it's beautiful. It's not a problem for me. I just want to make sure we're clear together. as a
Again,
group.
I'm speaking for me. I don't want to prevent a builder or a homeowner to build. I just want to have a good process that he understands on how to mitigate that if he does have to take it down. I think we want him not to. That's our preference. But there may be circumstances that he will have, that he'll have
You've
to.
got to be able to mitigate it.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Is there something, when somebody submits something to the city that they want to develop a piece of property, is there a checklist that says, do you have this white oak on your property?
If you were to come in as an owner of a pre-existing lot, one of those 50 that are out there, there's no checklist that says, do you have a white oak on your property? If you're a developer that's coming in and you want to build 30 homes,
Mhm.
you're going to go through a pre-app, we're going to look at the state
Yeah.
data bank and go out and take a look at the land and say, well, you need to go out and verify this. But for you, one property owner, one house, that's not part of the building permit process.
Yeah, 'cause I wonder if anybody would,
Big trees that raise up.
if there would even be any awareness of the fact that this is a protected tree.
One of the things that I hope that we do at some point is that we come up with a center branded signs or fencing or something like that, where everybody then knows, oh, this is an area that is a center protected area. So that, you know, whether it's an oak or whether it's a habitat for a wetland or whether it's a buffer for a fish-bearing stream, when development comes through, they put up these similar kinds of identifications. So you begin to know over time as a community
That makes
what's
sense.
protected, what's not protected.
Right.
Wayfinding.
Are we pursuing having our own bank? Is that, we
No, it's
discussed
just-
that, is that something, is that way out of?
It's conceptual at this point.
Is
It's
that
conceptual,
pretty
right.
wild? Okay.
I think it's a good idea.
There, just to throw this out there, the city of Vancouver, now this isn't specific to oaks, it's part of their tree ordinance, has a payment in lieu system where you pay a dollar amount per tree, or I can't remember how it works. Might be based on the diameter of the tree, but that goes into a city fund, and then that allows the city to go out and plant trees, whether it's street trees or trees on city property. Just throwing that out there.
It's a good idea, as long as the funds can only be spent for that purpose.
Exactly.
Right.
Can we have that be one of the steps before they get to external bank in our process review?
There are.
We would have to set up the fund and everything though, right?
Payment in lieu for wetlands. And ecology has guidance on drafting language for that. But again, that's a city administrative thing, and I'm not knowledgeable on how that works. And couldn't advise on that. But we could just give you the language that's out there so you can look at it, see if it's something that the city.
It sounds
wants to-
like a neat idea. I don't see how it could hurt anything.
And that would control keeping it within the locality.
Yeah.
True.
Meeting the goal of making the center a better place.
Yeah.
So the bank that they contribute to already, there's evidently procedures to figure out how, you know, based on what you're removing, how much you have to pay into this bank. So we wouldn't necessarily need to come up with our own values for that. We could just use what already exists for the bank.
Well, for wetlands, that's what the Fargo Lake Bank does do correctly. There's a value, there's a ratio that's applied as to how much credit you're going to buy based on how much impact you're going to have, correct?
That is correct for the bank itself, but there's also the payment in lieu
That's the
option.
difference.
That's a different scenario.
Well, that's what I was thinking of.
Okay.
And that's locally administered. If an entity wants to take that on, they would collect the funds. But again, it would be based on a ratio.
Yeah.
There's like a dollar amount. This formula would figure it out, and then that applicant would pay into the city with an in lieu fund, and the city would be responsible for administering those dollars to go to a project to create new wetlands.
It does not make it so burdensome for your team to incorporate that into our document. There is some sort of a market value fair system out there that you could adopt and easily plunk into what we have without having to do a bunch of
Yeah, I'll look at
studies.
the draft language that Ecology has and maybe send it to the proper channels for you guys to review, so you can take a look at it, and then we could,
That's for wetlands.
That's
What about
specific to
the
wetlands.
Improved trees.
The tree, and we could.
Yeah, I was talking about the payment in lieu.
So there's payment in lieu, it could be for multiple things. You could have a payment in lieu
Yeah.
for trees, you could have a payment in lieu for wetlands.
Yeah.
Depends on where you wanted to go. But we can pull up the City of Vancouver's code and pull that out as well.
You might want to check with the city controller to make sure that what type of different funds we'd have to set up to do this. Because they're going to have a separate fund, a separate requirement, and
To make sure that.
make sure
we're able to do
that he thinks that'll work before we go forward on that one. And we really need to make sure we know whether we have the right language in the fund so that it can't be used anywhere else.
We run it by our finance guy for sure.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
But I agree with what you're saying, and I think that if the other cities in the county are using this model, then we can rely upon them as at least a.
Boilerplate, yeah.
That might help buy some
Mhm.
credibility.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just
Thanks,
Thank
good.
you, guys. And we'll see you,
reflecting back,
and we'll see you again.
Yeah.
just reflecting back to when we did the shoreline program many, many years ago. This process is a lot easier.
Yes.
And it's a lot clearer. And it doesn't circle back on itself
No, it
anywhere
doesn't.
near as much as that other one did.
Shoreline programs are notoriously confusing, so even more than.
Mhm.
That's next year. It's true. We've been saying all along, this is a much simpler process.
I remember being in meetings there where we had 15 scientists with
Yeah.
different opinions.
And 30 new pages of drafts every single week.
Right.
And that we were looking at, having to go through all those drafts and make sure that we concurred with the changes proposed. And it went on for month after month after month after month.
You must have liked it, though.
We're just too stubborn, I think.
One of the interesting things was I did a lot of drafting
Oh, yeah.
and comments on it, which got a lot of, back from ecology, got a lot of pushback and didn't like it and all of that. And they come up with another draft 2 months later and have my words in it.
Mm-hmm.
You must
Hey,
have done something
word
right.
for word for word for word.
They just wanted to clean it down.
I didn't care one way or the other, but it was just interesting, the whole process.
Mm-hmm. It was.
Thank you.
Thank you as
Thank
well.
you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Good evening.
Is that somebody's water bottle?
Oh, yes, thank you.
Well, I think we still have some unfinished business. The outdoor lighting code
Okay.
update.
So that's what I was asking, if you received an email from me, which I
Just-
sent tonight in this office right here. So basically, after the July meeting, the planning commission made some changes to the lighting code. We agreed that there would be a transmittal letter. Commissioner Hill participated in that. And so there's been some back and forth as to how that letter should be made simpler and clearer and easier to understand. And so that has happened, and so that letter and comments from Commissioner Member Smith will go to the city council, hopefully tomorrow.
Great.
And I have requested a date. I've asked folks for a date for the council meeting, if you recall, and I don't have one for you. But I would still encourage you to, because the council sets their own agenda, I've asked for a date, but whenever we get that, I would still encourage each of you individually to reach out to the council members. You're totally okay to do that. It's a legislative process. It's not quasi-judicial. And make sure that we have the votes this time.
Yeah.
So that's just a quick update on it. I think that's off the table now and moving forward.
Good.
What about the, all right, go ahead.
I didn't hear back in any of my comments, and I didn't expect to, but I apologize for missing the last meeting. I wanted to be there, and when I listened to the audio the following day, I was shocked because of where we were with that code, and then one meeting, and then it was completely different. And so I wanted to be clear on where I was at with that. So if you did take the time to read those, I don't know if you did or not, but I appreciate that.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you for doing that, Jeremy. And my strategy has always been that we need to be open, transparent with everything that's going on. Everybody's views need to be respected. And
Absolutely.
So that can happen with any ordinance that we're working with. So thank you for doing that.
Thanks.
The other thing in my, well, let's see, the cottage housing, I'm probably not going to get into it at this point, but we left it sort of hanging in the air last time.
Right, we did.
And so I've, in my memo to you, I have given you the, in red, my suggested changes to the draft of the code, and then I've also given you a track changes version of how those suggestions would go in. The goal, my goal, to be totally transparent, is to try to find a way for you to allow cottage housing development in some single-family residential situations.
Right.
You don't have a lot of medium-density land, so you're not going to see many of these projects. But because you have so many critical areas, as we've just been talking about, you end up with appendages. And so I'm looking for ways to try to maximize the value of the property while still protecting the open space and the critical areas. That's
Is
the
that the
goal.
idea that these cottage developments would primarily be adjacent to some protected land?
Exactly.
Okay.
And
So you
if
can
we want
protect
to,
land And you can get more density to do that.
On your comments regarding this, you say this, you've got this set out to us? Cottage housing?
Well, this all would have been in your package.
Yeah. it
What I
was.
sent out tonight
okay.
was the outdoor lighting code
Right, okay.
letter
Okay.
and Jeremy's comments.
I got you. I
But
got
all that
that.
was in your packet.
Right, right.
So don't need to resend that for next
Right.
meeting.
so if we want to support your goal, then we need to approve your edits in red.
Right.
I recommend that. And some of those
Not
edits
your
are
goal,
also
but the goal.
the goal. And
Yeah.
some of those edits are from Councilmember Bach as well.
Okay.
So we need to feed this back to you, our comments?
If you have any comments, I'm around for until the end of the first week of September, and I can work on it.
And you're gone for a month?
I'll be back by Halloween.
Maybe,
Hmm?
maybe. Or is it for sure?
I live here. I've told you all the story. Okay, so yeah, I'm taking an extended break right now.
Yeah.
But my plan is to return back to the Great Pacific Northwest because my whole family's here. And what I do with you in the city of La Center, Jeff and I are having conversations about.
When I say maybe, I mean if your wife is ready to come back to the Northwest.
We don't
from
have
the
return
cabin.
tickets yet, okay?
Where are you going, Eric?
Her family has had a cottage up in the Adirondack State Park in upstate New York for the last 100 years. It's a little small one-room cottage on a river in a small little village with a library and a couple of restaurants. There's a canoe and a kayak on the dock, and we paddle 90 miles that way, and I do a lot of portages, and 6 miles that way and 4 miles that way.
Nice.
And a lot of books to read. So, she's
awesome.
retired, that's why we're doing this.
Yeah.
So. Okay, that's all I have.
Okay.
Do you have any other questions of me? We did not get into the work plan. I know that Chairperson McLean is very eager to get that work plan set.
We can work on that next month.
I think that was a great idea. Jeff, you may want to weigh in on some of those things related to work that you were doing too. They're on the board right there, cottage housing, Timmon Landing, sub-area, accessory dwelling code, accessory dwelling unit. We've got a gap that it's creating from the code, but we don't really allow those, and I think we should. Food carts kind of got stalled. We haven't done anything in that in a long time. And then some of these other things are probably not as pressing, like trails and site standards and whatnot. And then the Shorelines Master Program update. Jeff, you are applying for some funding for that?
We received an offer from Ecology for a grant. It's approximately $11,000 to support that work. So this, heard about the torturous process of doing shorelines the last time. This is just an update to the Shoreline Master Program, so it won't be anything like the process you went through before. It'll be streamlined and simple, kind of like the critical areas ordinance.
That'd be good.
And you're not alone. All the other jurisdictions are doing that right now. The county's going through the process too. It's been fairly straightforward. I think that's all that I have. Hopefully this was productive.
Oh, that was
very productive.
You're going to do a great job.
Great job on, yeah, that was, thank you so much. I think that's a good tag team there, and I think that's going to help us as a city and us as a commission tremendously.
Good. I think they'll do great for you. That's all I have.
Anyone else have anything?
I move we adjourn.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
Are all you all in favor of adjourning?
Aye.
We are adjourned.
Thank you for holding down the fort there.
You bet. I read your conversation.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah. Yeah, that was strange. But different objects have different pull. Different people have different.
Oh, yeah, we